On this episode of Doing the Most, we're taking a viewer-submitted recipe for a mead cider beer, and we're making it our own way.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
This is a conversation that started almost a year ago with a viewer named Glenn. Glenn was curious if the Wampus Cat, our infamous braggot recipe for beginners, could be somehow adopted to be a Graf, which is a beer meets cider. So Glenn and I went back and forth a little bit, and then a few months later, he emailed me some results of his testing. It was definitely in the spirit of doing the most. Glenn did his mash all in apple juice, and what that meant was that he had to adjust the pH of the apple juice in order to get a functional mash, because the mash needs a specific pH range in order for the enzymes to do their work. So this involved the addition of calcium hydroxide to bring the mash up into the range of 5 pH, and then later adjusting the wort back down into the 3s using malic acid, which is the primary acid in apples. This was all a lot, and Glenn's recipe ended up being a pretty high gravity situation, really big beer, and it required some finesse in order to pull off. And I, in my emails to Glenn, said, I see this as more of like a refreshing summer, fall time drink. Something with a lower gravity, lower ABV on the other end of it. And then I wondered if instead of using all apple juice, if you couldn't use water, like a typical beer brewing process, and shoot for a lower volume coming out of your boil, and then top it up with apple juice concentrate, so you're not having to do all the chemistry with the mash. And so I told Glenn, you know what, buddy, I'm gonna brew my version, and I'm gonna send you a couple of bottles. And I did, and Glenn sent me some of his feedback, which we'll get to in a little bit when we do our tasting. So I'm gonna put our recipe up on the screen, and I gotta give credit to Glenn because I used a lot of the same moving parts. I used a very similar grain bill, just removing all of the 2-row out of the equations because I was going to be adding so much sugar in the apple juice concentrate. And then I also did a slightly lower dry hop than Glenn did. And I'll put both recipes in the description so that way you can take a look at his versus mine. But as you can see here with my recipe, it was still a very complex brew with a lot going on. And it was also a relatively big brew day making this thing happen. So before we get to the tasting and see how my mead cider beer Graf turned out, let's take a look at that brew day and how the whole thing came together. Our brew day started with 5.5 gallons of water that we used as our strike water. Turned our gas on and got that flame going. And time to mill our grain. So I put all that in my grain mill, got it milled up so we can expose the insides, so that way we can get more out of the starches and have those enzymes in the grain convert them into sugars for us. That's milled directly into the brew bag. And when we get up to strike temperature, which here I was going for 162, just overshot just by a hair, no big deal, we kill our gas and add in our grain. We're going to steep that for 1 hour, stirring occasionally just to make sure everything is broken up in there. And then after that hour is complete, we'll pull the bag out and squeeze as much of the liquid out of that bag as we can before we give that grain to the dog and the chickens. So our flame goes back on, and it's now time for a boil. And we're gonna do a 1 hour boil on this with several hops additions. I'll put the schedule up here on the screen. So all of these go in over the course of an hour, and then at the end, we'll be also adding our buckwheat honey and apple juice concentrate. And that's 11 cans of apple juice concentrate we're gonna be using. So after all of our hops additions are done and our wort chiller is sanitized, we will cut the heat and get that cooled down. And as we're cooling it down, we'll add that whirlpool addition of hops. Stir, stir, stir. And then we'll add in our honey. This is buckwheat honey. It's very dark, rich, kind of molassesy honey. Adds a nice big body to meads and braggots. As that's chilling down, we will start adding our frozen apple juice concentrate, which will also help to rapidly chill our wort. Once that's down to yeast pitching temperature in the low 80s, we'll get that transferred off to a sanitized carboy. And this ended up making right under 5 gallons. I probably could have started with a little bit more strike water, and our gravity was 1.065. I used USO5 yeast for this on the recommendation of my local brew shop because it will help maintain some of those apple-y flavors. And then we let that ride. Once fermentation was complete and we were about ready to keg, I added the dry hop addition 3 days before kegging. And those went right on in there. Then I transferred it off to a keg and added my priming sugar. I used 3.5 ounces of cane sugar directly in the keg to prime this up. So instead of carbonating by force pressure, I carbonated just like you would priming bottles of beer with priming sugar. Just priming sugar in the keg and let it sit out for 3 weeks at room temperature. And then it went into the keezer to serve. All right, here she is. As you saw there, I carbonated it naturally in the keg, which is a thing I'd never done before, and that was kind of cool. Let's take a taste. It smells like apple juice, apple cider. It definitely has a fermented apple smell. You can smell that it's just got a little bit of funk to it. It's very apple forward. And then that's backed up by a big heft from the grain. Specifically, you can taste the dark grain in there. There's, something going on in that grain that's kind of dragging it down, kind of pulling it down and making it a little bit darker, maltier, deeper, less expressive kind of than I wanted. It's a little bit like a porter, but with apples mixed in, if that makes sense. And I think some of that is probably the buckwheat honey kind of pulling it down into those darker flavors too. It's not quite as refreshing as I'd hoped it would be. It's still good, it's still interesting. I think that one glass would probably be kind of all I'd want for a night. I'm not disappointed by it, but I do think I wanted it to be lighter and brighter. Still a very interesting mix. You pick up some of the honey note from the buckwheat. You definitely get that big backing from the malt. And of course, the apple is kind of ever present in here. Like I said, I sent a couple bottles to Glenn to check out, and here's his feedback. He says, right out of the gate, it's hops on the nose, with apple chasing close behind. No honey though, it's likely hiding beneath the hops. And while I agree there's not like a big honey bear honey flavor, Glenn, I do think you can pick up some of that depth of the buckwheat honey in there. Quite hops forward, which I like, and a nice balance of both grain and apple following, though I think the grain definitely dominates. I agree with him there. He goes on to say, the aftertaste is very much like a dry hopped cider, which is a lot of fun. In closing, he says, all in all, I like it. It is definitely easy to drink and very good cold. I do think a touch of back sweetening could make it even better by bringing out a bit more of the honey and apple, though that would take a deft touch because too much would ruin it. It is, after all, a beer, and beer isn't supposed to be very sweet. And then at the end, Glenn says he can't determine if he likes his version or my version better, which I think is part of the fun of an experiment like this. If I was going to do this again, I'd probably drop all the dark malt, and I would probably dial the hops back by about 30% or so. Just enough that you're letting the honey peek through. And, you know, in Glenn's version, he had the wildflower honey that the Wampus Cat recipe always has, but I omitted it because I didn't want to inflate my gravity too much and raise the ABV too much and dry it out too much. And I think maybe I might just go off script if I were to do this again and not use the buckwheat honey, but still use something big and rich like alfalfa blossom or avocado blossom honey, something that's big and kind of competes with the other flavors, but it's not so dark that it doesn't help pull it down and make it kind of an earthy, rich, again, porter style dark beer. Overall, I had a blast with this. I do think that this recipe has promise. And again, I think just like making it without those dark malts would help make it something that's a little bit more in that refreshing fall, autumn kind of vibe, because it is apple cider season, and so it's a great time to make something like this. I hope you enjoyed this little experimental video. If you did, hit the subscribe button down there and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new content coming up. And of course, follow us on Instagram, join our Discord server, be a part of the Doing the Most community. There are a lot of Doing the Mosters there, and they're always excited to help you out with your brew projects. Until next time, happy brewing, happy cider season, and cheers.